Morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Fionnuala Aoláin, Professor of Law at the Queen's University of Belfast, and involved in this project in two ways. I work with Rory and Lena on the project that we are advancing on socioeconomic rights in the context of conflict and post-conflict settings. And Bill Rolston and I are working on a project together which is looking at the colonialism piece of the transitional justice puzzle and exploring the ways in which colonial pasts continue to have a long-standing reach into the contemporary, and the ways in which colonial pasts shape both the experience of harm, but also the ways in which we can or should, exploring the ways whether we can or should remedy the harms of colonial pasts in the present. It's in this context that I'm going to make a couple of remarks to the discussion today, particularly focused on patriarchy. As a feminist scholar of international law and human rights, I have always tried to integrate this sort of feminist analysis into the substantive work that I do. And one of the really exciting things about the projects that we're all working on is the way in which that gender analysis is really mainstreamed in or central to the way we both shape the idea of the problem that we're working with and the kinds of solutions or analysis that we are deriving from the work we're doing. So let me say a little bit about patriarchy. I think it's an interesting thing to note that patriarchy is sort of a word that's out of fashion with feminists, also in some ways out of fashion with liberals. It's a word that gets less used perhaps than it should, or less consistently analytically applied to many of the contemporary problems that we face in conflict, post-conflict and transitional settings. Maybe just to say a little bit about that, the origins of patriarchy are found, the word patriarchy, its genealogy, is found in Roman law, in the idea of the pater familias, the patriarchal head of the family. So there's a deep connection between the sort of notion of patriarchy and the function of the family in society, and the ways in which the role as head of household is then replicated across a range of other key sites in social structures, in political power, and in economic practice. Some of the challenges, I think, or the perceived challenges of working with this term are, one, its association with the family, and often the ways in which the family is such a deep site of contestation for feminists, one that's really argued and fought over, one that many feminists are not so comfortable working within. More than that, I think there's a sense that patriarchy is sort of an essentialism approach, that it sort of reduces a discussion of a complex set of interactions around gender and sex to a highly binary notion of male-female, but also of the particularities of men's roles through the prism of patriarchy, and has been seen in some ways as been out of step with more textured language like intersectionality and critical feminist theories, including critical race feminists working in the spaces that we're talking about. But I think I would make the argument for the continued relevance of this terminology, and particularly its relevance to understanding the impact of colonial pasts on the present. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. I think it's also really important to hold on to this language in part, and this concept in part, because I think the relevance of patriarchy, the importance of patriarchal form and its expression in law continues to be felt in the power of masculinity, in the power of that expression in conflict, in post-conflict, and in peacemaking settings. And so I think there's this sort of distinct line to be drawn between the expression of masculinities in these contemporary sites, which is not just about the number of men in the room, but the way in which the work is done, with the genealogy of patriarchy. Let me say a little bit about why I think patriarchy is indispensable to understanding colonial legacies. It states the obvious, I think, to say that colonial power had profound patriarchal underpinnings. And that's not only in the structure of male power, which defined colonial exercises, whether in Ireland or in places like Colombia, or in French colonies too. But it's also to say that the working out of power from the family shaped the way in which the state then went out to colonize and engage in colonial practices in other places. I think it's really important, and one of the things that we hope to explore, particularly in the Colombian process, which is where Bill and I are doing a lot of our comparative work, is the distinct role and regulation of the family as part of the colonial project, and how those historical legacies are in fact, in some sense, hardwired in to some of the contemporary challenges we face around gender equality, gender inclusion, and the experience of women both during conflict, but also the capacity to engage women substantively in peacemaking and peace enforcement. I think one of the key elements of that I see is the distinctions that are drawn between particular colonial subjects, usually men, and the ways in which particular men were drawn into and made part of the colonial project. So the complexity of the colonial project is that, of course, it's never just done by the colonizer alone. It involves a range of entrapments, we might call them, or distinct benefits that accrue to particular groups in society during the course of the colonial project, that classic divide and conquer strategy. But the masculinities of men and the role of benefits in families were distinctly tied to that ensnaring process. And some of the key distinctions and some of the ways in which it becomes difficult to dislodge power and benefits, and benefits in particular in the post-conflict and transitional setting, have deep roots in these colonial structures, which in themselves also have these profound gender underpinnings and gender benefits that were received by particular men and particular families in colonial settings. The final comment I'd like to make in this context is also a complex and heavily contested one, which is to address the centrality of sexual conquest and sex-based ordering to the colonial enterprise. Scholars such as Pasha Bueno Hansen, working in the Peruvian context, have outlined and really demonstrated to us how sexual domination was an essential part of the colonial project, and the modern day experiences of sexual violation, systemic sexual violation for minority and indigenous groups in Peru, were actually overlaid on those colonial patterns of both economic expropriation, but also sexual domination and sexual expropriation. And those patterns of owning bodies as well as owning space in colonial settings have long and deep roots. And again, it's really disclosing or identifying the trenchant and deep nature of patterns that may look like they're incidental or modern in conflicted or transitional societies, and understanding that the pathways of those violations are long and deep and really encoded in ways that makes them very difficult to dislodge. Now, the harder part, of course, from the colonial perspective is how do we best dislodge and redress the challenges that we face when even if we can recognize and see those patterns, what kinds of remedies are available to us in the contemporary moment when many of these colonial modalities are long since set down and are now encoded as, if you want, as normal in societies. And I think that's the challenge I hope to discuss in the Q&A, and it's, I hope, the challenge that we will be able to address in the work that we're doing both in Northern Ireland but also in Colombia in this project. Many thanks to you all.